Four people heard the same message that Sunday morning. Before the week was over, one would walk away from God, one would break every promise he made, one would choose money over mercy, and one quiet woman would plant a seed that changed an entire town. The bells of St. Joseph Catholic Church rang across Millbrook, Ohio, as families hurried through the cold morning air. Inside, sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, casting blue and gold patterns across the wooden pews. Father Michael Anderson stood before the congregation with an open Bible in his hands. "The Word of God is like a seed," he began. "It is offered to every heart, but not every heart receives it the same way." Near the back of the church, Ethan Carter shifted impatiently in his seat. At 58, he carried the bitterness of a man who believed God had abandoned him. He had come only because his sister had called 3 times that morning. As Father Michael spoke about faith, Ethan stared at the crucifix with a cold expression. A few rows ahead, Ryan Mitchell leaned forward, completely absorbed. The 27-year-old had always loved powerful sermons. He nodded at every sentence, already imagining himself becoming the kind of man people admired for his generosity. Across the aisle, Madison Reed glanced down at the phone hidden beneath her coat. A message from her business partner flashed across the screen. The multi-million-dollar development deal was moving forward. She looked toward the altar for a moment, then returned to the glowing numbers in her hand. Only Grace Miller remained completely still. The 32-year-old nurse held a worn notebook on her lap, carefully writing Father Michael's words. "A seed cannot bear fruit unless it is received, protected, and allowed to grow," the priest continued. "Faith is not proven by what we hear on Sunday. It is proven by what we do when love becomes inconvenient." Those words made Grace pause. At the end of Mass, Father Michael did not immediately dismiss the congregation. His expression grew solemn. "Last night, the Parker family lost their home in a fire," he announced. "Daniel and Rebecca escaped with their 2 children, but they lost nearly everything. Rebecca is pregnant, and their youngest son needs medication for severe asthma." A heavy silence settled over the church. "We need food, clothing, temporary housing, transportation, and volunteers," Father Michael said. "This is our opportunity to become good soil." Ethan lowered his eyes, already searching for an excuse. Ryan stood quickly and promised loud enough for several people to hear that he would organize everything. Madison calculated how much a public donation might benefit her company's reputation. Grace quietly wrote the Parker family's name beneath the final line of the sermon. 4 hearts had received the same seed. As they walked out of St. Joseph Church, no one could yet see what was growing inside them, but their next decisions would reveal everything. Ethan Carter left St. Joseph Catholic Church before the final hymn had ended. The heavy wooden doors closed behind him, cutting off the sound of the choir. Cold winds swept across the parking lot, carrying dry leaves over the pavement. Ethan pulled his coat tighter and walked toward his faded dark blue pickup truck without looking back. Father Michael's words followed him anyway. "Faith is proven by what we do when love becomes inconvenient." Ethan unlocked the truck and tossed the church bulletin onto the passenger seat. The Parker family's name was printed beneath a list of urgent needs: temporary housing, winter clothing, transportation, food, and medication. He crumpled the paper in one hand. People always wanted something: money, time, sympathy, prayer. They spoke as though kindness could repair every broken life. Ethan had once believed that too. 6 years earlier, his wife Laura had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. Ethan had attended every appointment, driven through snowstorms for treatments, and spent countless nights sitting beside her hospital bed. He had prayed until his knees hurt. Members of St. Joseph had brought casseroles and promised miracles. Father Michael had placed a hand on Laura's forehead and asked God for healing. Laura died on a gray Tuesday morning in February. After the funeral, Ethan stopped praying. He still attended Mass occasionally, mostly because his older sister, Margaret, refused to give up on him. But he no longer expected God to listen. In Ethan's mind, heaven had remained silent when he needed an answer most. His phone rang as he started the engine. Margaret's name appeared on the screen. Ethan considered ignoring it, but he already knew she would call again. "What?" he answered. "Did you hear Father Michael's announcement?" Margaret asked. "I was sitting in the same church. The Parker family needs help. Daniel worked with Laura at the elementary school." Ethan's grip tightened around the steering wheel. "That was years ago. It still matters. What do you expect me to do? You have an empty guest room, and your truck could help move donated furniture." Ethan looked through the windshield toward the church entrance. Grace Miller stood near the steps, speaking with Father Michael while writing something in her notebook. Ryan Mitchell was surrounded by several parishioners, waving his hands enthusiastically as he described his plans. Madison Reed walked toward a polished black SUV, already talking on her phone. Ethan felt irritation rising in his chest. "People need to solve their own problems," he said. "Their house burned down, Ethan, and I lost my wife. Nobody solved that for me." Margaret fell silent. The words hung between them, sharper than Ethan intended, but he did not apologize. "You are not the only person who has suffered," she finally said. Laura understood that. Ethan ended the call. He pulled out of the parking lot and turned onto County Road 18. The bare trees lining the road appeared black against the pale winter sky. His anger slowly settled into the familiar emptiness he carried everywhere. 2 miles outside town, Ethan saw an old minivan parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. A man stood beside the open hood while a woman and 2 children waited inside. As Ethan drove closer, he recognized them. Daniel Parker raised one hand, hoping the approaching truck would stop. For a brief moment, Ethan's foot moved toward the brake. Through the minivan window, 8-year-old Noah Parker coughed into his sleeve. Rebecca held an inhaler near him while trying to comfort her younger daughter. Their clothing looked mismatched, likely borrowed after the fire. Daniel's face was exhausted, his hands dark with grease from the engine. Ethan slowed down. Daniel stepped closer to the road. Then Ethan remembered the bulletin. Temporary housing, transportation, medication. One favor would become another. A ride would become a request for money. Help would become responsibility. He pressed the gas pedal. The truck surged forward, leaving the Parker family behind. Daniel lowered his hand and watched the taillights disappear. Inside the minivan, Rebecca looked away, unwilling to let her children see the disappointment on her face. Noah coughed again. Several minutes later, Grace's small silver sedan pulled onto the shoulder. She stepped out immediately, still dressed in the navy blue coat she had worn to church. "Is everyone okay?" she asked. Daniel nodded toward the dead engine. "The car gave out. We were trying to reach the motel Father Michael arranged." Grace looked at Noah, noticed his strained breathing, and opened the back door of her car. "Let's get your family somewhere warm first," she said. "We can deal with the van afterward." Farther down the road, Ethan stopped at a red light. In the rearview mirror, he could just make out the distant flash of hazard lights. For 1 second, he imagined Laura sitting beside him. She would have made him turn around. She would have reminded him that pain was not permission to stop caring. But Ethan pushed the memory away and turned on the radio to drown out the silence. By the time the light turned green, Father Michael's sermon had almost vanished from his thoughts. The seed had fallen near his heart, but bitterness had hardened the ground. Before it could take root, Ethan had driven away and left it beside the road. By 7 o'clock Monday morning, Ryan Mitchell had already posted 3 videos about the Parker family. Standing outside St. Joseph Catholic Church with the burned house visible in the distance, he spoke directly into his phone with the confidence of someone announcing a movement. "Millbrook takes care of its own," Ryan declared. "By the end of this week, we are going to give this family everything they need." Within hours, the video had been shared hundreds of times. Neighbors praised Ryan's compassion. Local businesses offered supplies. One community page called him the young man restoring faith in Millbrook. Ryan read every comment. Each word of admiration made the promise feel easier. Inside the church basement, Father Michael had begun arranging donated coats, canned food, blankets, and children's toys. Grace arrived after finishing an overnight shift at the hospital. Her face was tired, but she immediately started labeling boxes according to size and need. Ryan entered several minutes later, carrying coffee and wearing a brand new volunteer t-shirt printed with the words, "Hope for the Parkers." "We need a real system," he announced. "I'll coordinate volunteers, donations, transportation, and repairs." Father Michael gave him a cautious smile. "That is a great deal of responsibility. I can handle it." Ryan opened his laptop and created schedules, fundraising pages, and a list of ambitious goals. He promised Daniel Parker that he would gather a crew to clean the damaged property. He told Rebecca that furniture would arrive within days. He even assured their children that the community would rebuild something better than what they had lost. For the first several hours, Ryan seemed unstoppable. He carried boxes whenever someone was watching, posed for photographs with volunteers, and gave an interview to a local reporter. His enthusiasm spread quickly. More people arrived because they believed Ryan had everything under control. But by Tuesday morning, the weather changed. Cold rain fell over Millbrook, turning the Parker property into deep mud. Several volunteers canceled. A hardware store delayed its promised delivery, and the insurance company refused to authorize cleanup until an inspector completed the paperwork. Ryan stood beneath a plastic canopy, staring at the ruined house. This was supposed to move faster, he complained. Daniel, wearing borrowed work boots, lifted another piece of burned wood into a dumpster. These things take time, he said. We appreciate whatever you can do. Ryan heard gratitude in Daniel's voice, but it was not the kind he expected. There was no applause, no camera, and no visible victory. Only rain, smoke-stained debris, and work that seemed endless. By noon, Ryan's clothes were soaked. Mud covered his shoes. When Father Michael asked him to help move water-damaged furniture, Ryan checked his phone. The views on his latest video had slowed. A commenter accused him of using the family's tragedy for attention. Another asked why the fundraiser had not yet shown clear results. Ryan's excitement began to collapse. That afternoon, he snapped at an older volunteer for placing boxes in the wrong truck. Later, he blamed the church secretary for failing to confirm the delivery schedule. Grace watched him pace beneath the canopy, more concerned with his online reputation than the family standing beside him. Ryan, she said gently. Rebecca needs someone to drive her to a prenatal appointment tomorrow. He hesitated. Tomorrow? I have work. You said transportation was covered. I said I would organize it. That does not mean I have to do everything myself. Grace studied his expression, but did not argue. Then help find someone who can. Ryan nodded without answering. The next morning, Rebecca waited outside the motel with a small overnight bag. Ryan never arrived. He had sent Father Michael a message shortly after midnight, explaining that an unexpected meeting required his attention. No meeting existed. Ryan stayed home, turned off his phone, and convinced himself that the project had become unreasonable. He had already inspired people. He had already raised awareness. Surely that counted for something. At the church, Father Michael quietly removed Ryan's name from the volunteer schedule. Grace drove Rebecca to the hospital before beginning another shift. By Friday, the hope for the Parkers' t-shirt lay forgotten beneath a pile of clothes in Ryan's bedroom. His promises had sounded strong inside the warmth of the church, but once service demanded patience, discomfort, and sacrifice, his enthusiasm disappeared. The seed had sprung up quickly within him, yet beneath the bright leaves, there had never been enough soil for roots. While Grace drove Rebecca Parker to the hospital, Madison Reed sat 30 floors above downtown Columbus, staring at a map that could make her company richer than ever. Red boundary lines surrounded 12 acres on the eastern edge of Millbrook. At the center of the proposed development sat the burned remains of the Parker family's home. Madison's business partner, Victor Hale, tapped the map with a silver pen. If we acquire these properties before the county announces the highway expansion, we control the entire corridor, he said. Retail space, luxury apartments, restaurants. This could be Reed Development's biggest project. Madison studied the projected numbers on the screen. The profits were enormous. Only days earlier, while sitting inside St. Joseph Church, she had considered offering one of her company's vacant apartments to the Parker family. She owned 6 furnished units near the hospital. Any one of them could have given Daniel, Rebecca, and their children a safe place to live. But she had never made the call. There is one complication, Victor continued. The Parkers still own their lot. The fire damaged the house, but the land is valuable. Madison leaned back in her chair. They are insured. Not enough to rebuild quickly. They are staying in a motel. The wife is pregnant, and the husband has missed work. They need cash now. Victor slid a purchase agreement across the glass table. The offer was less than half the property's expected value. Madison looked at the number and felt an uncomfortable pressure in her chest. Father Michael's voice returned to her. Faith is proven by what we do when love becomes inconvenient. She turned toward the window. Far below, traffic moved through the city like streams of light. Madison had spent 15 years building her company from a single rented office. She had survived dishonest investors, failed projects, and months when she could barely make payroll. Success had taught her never to hesitate, but success had also taught her to view every hardship as an opportunity. Give them 48 hours, Victor said. Once the highway plan becomes public, they will know what the land is worth. Madison did not sign immediately. Her phone buzzed with a message from Grace. Rebecca's appointment went well. The baby is healthy. They still need stable housing. Do you know of any available apartments? Madison read the message twice. For a moment, she imagined Rebecca standing beside the motel bed, trying to comfort 2 frightened children, while preparing for another baby. She imagined offering them a key, watching the children enter a warm apartment, and knowing she had used what God gave her to protect someone vulnerable. Her hand moved toward the phone. Victor watched her closely. This project could secure the company for the next decade. Madison locked the screen. "Send the offer," she said. That afternoon, Daniel received an envelope at the motel. He sat at the small table and read the purchase agreement, while Rebecca rested nearby. "This would pay our bills," he whispered. Rebecca looked at the amount. "But where would we go?" Daniel had no answer. Across town, Madison attended a charity luncheon at an expensive hotel. She smiled for photographs, donated $5,000 to a children's foundation, and accepted praise for her commitment to the community. No one in the ballroom knew that her company had just offered a desperate family far less than their land was worth. Later, Madison returned to her office alone. On her desk sat the church bulletin from Sunday, folded open to the parable of the sower. She started to place it in the trash, then stopped. Instead, she slipped it into a drawer and closed it. The word had not disappeared from her heart. She still heard it. She still understood it. But around it grew the thorns of profit, reputation, control, and fear of losing everything she had built. By choosing the deal, Madison had not rejected God openly. She had simply allowed a louder desire to take his place. And as the thorns tightened around the seed, the first green shoot of compassion vanished beneath them. Grace Miller learned about the purchase offer while checking Noah Parker's breathing in the cramped motel room. The boy sat on the edge of the bed, his small chest rising unevenly beneath an oversized sweatshirt. Grace placed a stethoscope against his back and asked him to take a slow breath. Across the room, Daniel held the papers from Reed Development. Rebecca stood beside him, with one hand resting protectively over her unborn child. "They want an answer by tomorrow," Daniel said. "The money could cover our debts and keep us in this motel for a while." "But after that?" Rebecca asked. "We would have no home and no land." Daniel stared at the signature line. Since the fire, every decision had felt like a choice between two losses. Grace finished examining Noah and handed Rebecca a written schedule for his medication. "His breathing sounds better," she said, "but the smoke and cold air are still affecting him. He needs a stable place to recover." Rebecca gave a tired smile. "We know." Grace looked around the room. Two children shared one bed. Clothes were stacked inside grocery bags. A hot plate sat beneath the window, though motel rules prohibited cooking. The Parkers had escaped the fire alive, but survival had become a daily struggle no one else could fully see. Grace could not offer them a house. Her own apartment was small, and most of her paycheck went toward rent, student loans, and the medical bills left from caring for her mother before she died. Still, she refused to believe that having little meant doing nothing. The next morning, Grace arrived at St. Joseph Church before sunrise. She sorted donated clothing, called 3 local landlords, and contacted a nonprofit that assisted families displaced by fires. When the office opened, she helped Daniel complete emergency housing applications and appealed the insurance company's delayed inspection. Father Michael found her in the church basement surrounded by forms, cardboard boxes, and half-finished coffee. "You worked all night at the hospital," he said. "They need these applications submitted today, and you need rest." Grace glanced at the notebook beside her. Under Father Michael's Sunday sermon, she had written one sentence and circled it twice. "Love becomes real when it costs something." Noah did not choose to lose his home, she said quietly. Rebecca should not have to worry about sleeping in a car while carrying a baby. Father Michael studied her tired face. "You cannot carry every burden alone. I know, but I can carry this part today." Grace never announced what she was doing. She did not photograph the donated supplies, or tell anyone that she had used nearly all her savings to purchase Noah's medication, winter coats for the children, and several weeks of groceries. When the pharmacy clerk warned that the cost would leave only a few dollars in her account, Grace hesitated. Her rent was due soon. Her car had begun making a grinding sound. One unexpected expense could place her in trouble. Then she remembered Noah struggling to breathe. She handed over her debit card. That evening, Grace delivered the medication to the motel. Rebecca opened the bag and immediately understood that it contained more than the church had promised. "We cannot let you pay for all of this," she said. "You are not taking anything from me," Grace replied. "You are allowing someone to help." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. Near the window, Daniel quietly folded the purchase agreement and placed it back inside the envelope. Grace's kindness had not solved every problem, but it reminded him that desperation did not have to make the decision for them. After leaving the motel, Grace drove to St. Joseph Church instead of going home. She entered the small side chapel and sat beneath the statue of the Virgin Mary. For the first time all week, no one needed an answer from her. Grace bowed her head, admitting in prayer that she was tired, frightened, and uncertain how much longer she could continue. Yet she did not ask to be released from the responsibility. She asked only for enough strength to remain faithful. Minutes later, exhaustion overcame her. Her head rested against the wooden pew as the chapel lights glowed softly around her. The seed in Grace's heart had not grown through grand promises or public praise. It had taken root through small acts of mercy, repeated when no one was watching. And that night, as she fell asleep before the image of the Virgin Mary, Grace was about to receive an answer, unlike anything she had expected. The chapel disappeared beneath Grace Miller's feet. One moment, her head rested against the wooden pew beneath the statue of the Virgin Mary. The next, she stood alone beneath a pale morning sky, surrounded by a field stretching farther than she could see. The earth was dry and cracked. Cold wind moved across the empty land, carrying dust through rows where nothing had grown. At Grace's feet lay 4 small bags of seed. The first had been torn open beside a hardened road. Birds circled overhead, sweeping down and carrying the seeds away before they could enter the ground. The second rested on a bed of stone. Tiny green shoots had already appeared, but their roots could not reach the soil beneath the rocks. As the sun rose, the fragile plants bent and withered. The third bag had spilled into a patch of thorns. The seeds had begun to grow, but dark vines twisted around the young stems, tightening until every leaf disappeared. Grace understood without anyone explaining. She saw Ethan driving past Daniel Parker's broken-down van, his face turned away from the suffering beside the road. She saw Ryan standing before a camera, making promises that sounded beautiful until rain, criticism, and hard work tested him. She saw Madison alone in her office, closing the church bulletin inside a drawer while a purchase agreement threatened to take the Parkers' land. Then Grace looked toward the fourth bag. It remained unopened in the center of the field. A woman stood beside it. She wore a simple white gown beneath a deep blue mantle. Her face was gentle, yet her eyes carried the quiet sorrow of someone who understood every human wound. Light surrounded her, not harsh or blinding, but warm enough to make the barren field feel less empty. Grace knew she was standing before the Virgin Mary. She lowered her head, suddenly aware of her exhaustion, fear, and hidden resentment. "I do not have enough," Grace whispered. "Not enough money, strength, or time. I cannot save everyone." The Virgin Mary did not tell her that the road would become easy. She did not promise that every prayer would be answered as Grace expected. Instead, she knelt and lifted the fourth bag of seed. In the distance, the cracked earth opened into a narrow strip of dark soil. It was small compared with the enormous field, but it was ready. The Virgin Mary placed the seeds into Grace's hands. Grace looked down. They were ordinary, small enough to disappear between her fingers. Then a quiet voice reached her heart. "You are not asked to control the harvest. You are asked to remain faithful to the seed." Images moved across the sky like reflections on water. Grace saw Rebecca holding her newborn child in a safe room. She saw Noah running without struggling for breath. She saw Daniel helping another family rebuild after losing everything. Then the vision changed. Ethan stood beside an elderly woman whose car had broken down. Ryan worked in silence without a camera nearby. Madison opened the doors of an apartment and placed a key into Rebecca's hand. Grace stared at the images. Can they still change? The Virgin Mary looked toward the road, the stones, and the thorns. No answer came in words, but Grace understood. Hardened ground could be broken open. Stones could be removed. Thorns could be cut away. No heart was beyond the mercy of God as long as it was willing to be changed. The wind grew stronger. Dark clouds gathered over the field, and thunder rolled in the distance. The coming storm seemed powerful enough to destroy everything. The Virgin Mary pointed toward the strip of good soil. Grace dropped to her knees and began planting. One seed, then another. She worked faster as the wind pulled at her clothes. Her hands became covered with dirt, but the small patch of earth began to glow beneath the gathering darkness. When the final seed entered the ground, rain fell. Grace awakened suddenly in the chapel. Morning light had begun to enter through the stained glass window. Father Michael stood several feet away, about to wake her, but stopped when he saw the tears on her face. Grace opened her hand. Resting against her palm was a single grain of wheat. She looked toward the statue of the Virgin Mary, then closed her fingers around the seed. Outside, storm clouds were moving toward Millbrook. Grace did not know what was coming, but for the first time all week, she no longer believed she had to carry the entire harvest alone. By noon, the sky over Millbrook had turned the color of steel. The National Weather Service issued a severe storm warning for central Ohio, but few residents expected the system to strengthen so quickly. Wind tore branches from trees, rain flooded county roads within minutes, and lightning knocked out power across half the town. At St. Joseph Catholic Church, Father Michael unlocked the parish hall and ordered the volunteers to prepare it as an emergency shelter. "Move the folding beds away from the windows," he said. "Bring every blanket from the basement. We may have families here all night." Grace slipped the grain of wheat from her dream into the pocket of her coat and joined him without mentioning what she had seen. Within an hour, the church filled with frightened residents carrying children, medical bags, and whatever belongings they had been able to grab. The Parker family arrived soaked and exhausted. Their motel had lost electricity, and water was already entering several ground-floor rooms. Rebecca sat near the altar with her daughter, while Daniel helped Father Michael move tables. Noah remained beside Grace, his breathing growing tighter as the damp air settled into his lungs. Across town, Ethan Carter watched the storm from his living room window. His sister called twice, asking him to bring his truck to the church and help transport elderly residents. Ethan ignored both calls. He checked the locks, started his generator, and told himself that people who had failed to prepare were not his responsibility. Still, when thunder shook the house, he remembered Laura. During storms, she had always filled thermoses with coffee and checked on neighbors who lived alone. Ethan closed the curtains so he would not have to look toward the church steeple in the distance. Ryan Mitchell arrived at St. Joseph wearing his volunteer shirt again. At first, he carried supply boxes and directed people toward open cots. When a local reporter appeared, Ryan moved closer to the entrance and began explaining how the community had organized its emergency response. Then the basement started flooding. Father Michael handed Ryan a mop and asked him to help move food to the upper floor. Ryan stared at the muddy water spreading across the tiles. "Shouldn't the fire department handle this?" "They are responding to trapped families," Father Michael answered. "Right now, we are the help." Ryan worked for several minutes, but when the electricity failed and frightened children began crying in the darkness, his confidence vanished. He quietly slipped out through a side door, claiming he needed to check on his apartment. Madison Reed faced a different decision. 6 furnished units owned by her company still had power from a backup generator. Her assistant suggested offering them to families with medical needs. Victor Hale immediately objected. "If anything is damaged, the company is liable," he warned. "Those units are staged for investors tomorrow." Madison looked through the conference room windows as rain struck the glass. "One of those families includes a pregnant woman and a child with asthma," her assistant said. Madison's hand tightened around her phone. Grace had sent another message asking for emergency housing. For several seconds, Madison appeared ready to answer. Then Victor placed the development contract in front of her. "The investors are already nervous," he said. "Do not turn a business asset into a shelter." Madison silenced the phone. Back at St. Joseph, the temperature inside the church continued to fall. Grace moved from one person to another, checking blood pressure, distributing medication, and calming children as thunder rolled overhead. Then Noah's inhaler released only a weak burst. Grace examined it and felt her stomach drop. Nearly empty. "The replacement is at the hospital pharmacy," Rebecca said, panic entering her voice. "We were supposed to pick it up tomorrow." Grace called the hospital. The pharmacy still had Noah's prescription, but several roads were closed, and emergency crews could not deliver it. Noah leaned forward, struggling for each breath. Father Michael looked toward the doors as another gust shook the building. "No one should drive in this," he said. Grace placed her hand inside her coat pocket and felt the single grain of wheat. She remembered the dark field, the approaching storm, and the message that had entered her heart. Faithfulness did not mean controlling the harvest. It meant planting the next seed. Grace took her car keys from the table. Before anyone could stop her, she opened the church doors and stepped into the storm. Grace could barely see 10 feet beyond the windshield. Rain struck the glass faster than the wipers could clear it. Tree branches covered parts of County Road 18, and water rushed across the pavement in silver sheets. Still, she kept both hands on the steering wheel and continued toward Millbrook Regional Hospital. Inside St. Joseph Church, Noah Parker's breathing had grown shallow. Rebecca held him against her chest, while Father Michael watched the clock. Every minute Grace remained outside felt longer than the last. "Will she come back?" Noah whispered. Rebecca forced herself to smile. "Grace always comes back." 3 miles from the hospital, Grace's car struck a deep pool of water. The engine sputtered. Warning lights flashed across the dashboard, and the car rolled to a stop near a flooded intersection. Grace tried the ignition again. Nothing. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. Outside, the rain had already risen above the bottom of the car doors. For one moment, fear overwhelmed her. She pictured Noah waiting inside the cold church. She pictured the grain of wheat in her pocket and the field from her dream. Faithfulness meant planting the next seed. Grace pulled up her hood, stepped into the freezing rain, and began walking toward the hospital. Less than a mile away, Ethan Carter was driving his pickup truck through the storm. His sister had finally convinced him to deliver fuel to an elderly neighbor whose generator had stopped. He told himself he was helping only because Margaret would never leave him alone otherwise. Then his headlights found a woman walking beside the road. Grace leaned into the wind, one arm shielding her face. When Ethan recognized her, he slowed, but did not stop immediately. He had seen her before, standing beside the Parker family's disabled van after he had driven past them. He remembered Laura's voice, the Sunday sermon, and the silence inside his truck after he had abandoned a family in need. Ethan's foot hovered over the gas pedal. Then Grace stumbled. He hit the brakes. "What are you doing out here?" Ethan shouted as he pulled her into the passenger seat. "Noah's medicine is at the hospital," she answered, struggling to catch her breath. "His inhaler is almost empty." Ethan looked toward the flooded road ahead. "The bridge may be closed. Then we find another way." Something in her voice silenced him. Grace was frightened and exhausted, yet she had walked into the storm for a child who was not hers. Ethan turned the truck toward an old service road he had used years earlier. At the hospital, Grace collected Noah's medication, while Ethan waited beneath the emergency entrance. When she returned, a nurse handed them extra inhalers, blankets, and several boxes of supplies for the shelter. The drive back was worse. A fallen tree blocked the main road, forcing Ethan through muddy farmland. Twice, the truck nearly became trapped. Neither of them spoke much. But when Ethan saw Grace clutching the medicine against her chest, he kept driving. At St. Joseph, Daniel opened the doors as the pickup pulled into the parking lot. Grace rushed inside, soaked from head to toe. Noah was barely able to speak. Grace administered the medication and remained beside him until his breathing slowly became deeper and steadier. Rebecca covered her face and wept. Daniel placed both hands on Ethan's shoulders, unable to find words. Someone inside the shelter had recorded the moment Grace returned. By morning, the story had spread across Millbrook. But this time, it was not a story about public promises. It was about a nurse who walked into a storm, a bitter widower who finally stopped his truck, and a sick child who received help because two people chose compassion over fear. Residents began arriving at St. Joseph with food, dry clothing, generators, and medicine. Local restaurants opened their kitchens. Truck drivers delivered bottled water. Off-duty contractors repaired the flooded basement. Ryan saw the volunteers gathering and returned quietly, without his camera. Madison watched the news report from her office and stared at the keys to 6 empty apartments. Grace's act had not ended the storm. It had done something greater. It had reminded an entire town that love becomes powerful when one person is willing to act first. 3 days after the storm, sunlight returned to Millbrook. Broken branches still lined the streets, and generators hummed outside homes without power, but the worst had passed. Noah Parker was breathing normally again. Families had begun leaving the shelter, and volunteers were cleaning the last traces of muddy water from St. Joseph's basement. That Sunday afternoon, Father Michael asked Ethan, Ryan, Madison, and Grace to meet him in the garden behind the church. 4 clay pots waited on a wooden table. Each contained a different kind of ground. One was packed hard. One was filled with stones. One was tangled with thorns. The last held dark, freshly turned soil. Father Michael placed a small envelope of seeds beside them. "The storm did not create what was inside your hearts," he said. "It revealed it." No one answered. Ethan stared at the hardened soil. He had not slept well since driving Grace through the storm. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Daniel Parker raising his hand beside the broken minivan, and himself refusing to stop. "My wife believed helping people mattered," Ethan finally said. "After she died, I decided kindness was a lie, because it could not save her." His voice tightened. "I was angry at God, so I punished everyone who needed me." Father Michael did not excuse him. He simply placed a small gardening tool beside the hardened pot. Hard ground can be broken, he said, but only when someone is willing to strike the surface. Ryan stood before the pot of stones. The young man who once spoke louder than anyone now struggled to raise his eyes. I liked being seen as a good person, he admitted. When people praised me, serving felt easy. When the work became uncomfortable, I disappeared. He remembered Rebecca waiting outside the motel for a ride he had promised to provide. He remembered leaving the shelter while Grace remained behind. I confused emotion with faith, he said. I made promises without building the character to keep them. Ryan began removing the stones one by one. Madison remained silent the longest. She opened her leather purse and withdrew the Parker family's unsigned purchase agreement. Victor had pressured her to extend the deadline after the storm, believing their desperation would make them accept an even lower offer. Madison tore the contract in half. My company had 6 empty apartments while families slept on church floors, she said. I knew what was right, but I was afraid compassion would cost me something. She looked toward Grace. The truth is, I did not own my success. My success owned me. Madison reached into the third pot. The thorns scratched her hands as she pulled them free, but she did not stop. Grace stood before the good soil. The others expected Father Michael to praise her. Instead, Grace lowered her eyes. I wanted to quit too, she said. There were moments when I felt angry that no one else was helping. I began to believe everything depended on me. She removed the grain of wheat from her pocket. In my dream, the Virgin Mary reminded me that faithfulness is not the same as control. Good soil still needs rain, patience, and grace. It does not produce anything by its own power. Father Michael nodded. Then plant it. Grace pressed the grain into the soil and covered it gently. Ethan looked at the tool in his hand. Ryan looked at the stones beside his feet. Madison looked at the scratches on her palms. For the first time, they understood that the 4 soils were not permanent identities. A hardened heart could soften, shallow faith could deepen, thorns could be removed. But change required more than regret. It required action. Ethan offered his truck to transport displaced residents. Ryan volunteered to repair the flooded basement without posting about it. Madison handed Daniel Parker the keys to one of her furnished apartments and ordered her company to withdraw every offer on his land. Grace watched them quietly. The seed she had protected was no longer growing in only one heart. The harvest had begun. 6 months later, the empty field behind St. Joseph Catholic Church no longer looked barren. Rows of golden wheat moved beneath the summer wind, surrounding a new brick building with a simple wooden sign above its entrance, the Millbrook House of Mercy. The center offered temporary housing, food, medical assistance, and transportation for families in crisis. What had begun with one burned home had grown into a place of refuge for the entire community. Madison Reed had donated one of her company's buildings and created a permanent housing fund. She no longer measured every decision by profit alone. On opening day, she stood beside Rebecca Parker and placed the center's first key into her hand. Ryan Mitchell spent months repairing walls, replacing damaged floors, and assembling furniture. There were no cameras and no online announcements. When someone praised him, he simply returned to his work. Ethan Carter became the center's most dependable volunteer driver. His old pickup carried elderly patients to appointments, delivered groceries during snowstorms, and helped families move into safe homes. Each time he stopped for someone stranded beside the road, he remembered Laura, not with anger, but with gratitude for the love she had taught him. The Parker family rebuilt their home instead of selling their land. Daniel later joined the center's repair team, helping other families recover from fires and storms. Noah ran through the field without struggling for breath, while Rebecca held her healthy newborn daughter beneath the afternoon sun. Grace remained a nurse. She accepted no title and asked for no recognition. Near the statue of the Virgin Mary, she knelt beside a small patch of soil where the grain of wheat from her dream had once been planted. From that single place, several tall stalks had grown. Father Michael stood behind her as church bells rang across Millbrook. "One seed," he said softly. Grace watched Ethan help an elderly woman from his truck. She saw Ryan carrying boxes into the center and Madison welcoming a frightened family at the door. "One willing heart," Grace answered. The word of God had been offered to 4 souls. Only one had received it fully at first. But when that seed became courage, sacrifice, and mercy, it softened the hardened path, deepened the shallow ground, and pushed through the thorns. A single faithful life had become a harvest of love. And perhaps that was the lesson Millbrook would never forget. God does not ask anyone to create the whole harvest alone. He asks each heart to receive the seed and faithfully plant the next one. For more inspiring stories of faith, hope, and the loving guidance of the Virgin Mary, subscribe to Mary's Light in the Darkness and join a community searching for God's light in life's darkest moments.